The fire still smoked behind the supply depot. May 1945. Austria. Captain Robert Hayes walked across the vehicle yard. Two soldiers were shoveling wet ash into oil drums. The smell stayed low in the snow. Nobody spoke near the burn pit. 63 winter coats had disappeared before noon. The refugee line outside the rail station had stopped moving. Women stood beside wooden carts. 31 children were wrapped in army blankets that did not match. 4 hours later, the supply officer was standing beside Patton's jeep. Neither man spoke. The engine stayed running. This is what Patton did. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the stories about World War II that official occupation reports reduced to inventory numbers. Robert Hayes, Cleveland. Age 38. He'd been a quartermaster officer for 11 years. He'd seen burned depots, abandoned rail yards, and entire truck columns frozen outside Bastogne. But he'd never seen civilians waiting beside SS uniforms for warmth. The refugee station sat 14 miles north of Salzburg. 3 rail lines crossed there before the war, by May 1945. Only one still worked. The camp held 118 displaced civilians. 47 were children. 19 had arrived from a labor convoy near Linz 2 nights earlier. Snow fell again on May 11th, late spring. Temperature below freezing after midnight. The army depot behind the station contained 214 captured winter coats. 63 carried SS markings inside the collar, black stitching, unit runes, white inventory paint across the sleeves. Hayes ordered those 63 separated before sunrise. At 08:20, 2 fuel drums were rolled behind the warehouse. At 08:45, the coats were burning. Some men agreed with him. The Waffen-SS had guarded camps across occupied Europe. American soldiers had already found bodies outside Buchenwald and Ohrdruf only weeks earlier. One transportation officer said the uniforms should never appear on civilians under American control. Another officer disagreed. Captain William Turner, Philadelphia, age 31. He'd been moving refugee columns for 7 months. He'd seen frostbite, typhus wagons, and children sleeping beside dead horses, but he'd never seen winter clothing destroyed during active snowfall. Turner counted the line himself that afternoon. 118 civilians, 72 without proper coats, 9 elderly refugees sitting directly on frozen gravel beside the rail fence. The problem reached beyond one depot. 3 nearby camps had already reported shortages. Army blankets covered only part of the demand. Medical officers warned that exposure cases would rise within 48 hours if temperatures dropped again. The supply regulations were not clear. Captured SS equipment carried political risk. Occupation units feared photographs. They feared black market resale. They feared American troops wearing enemy items after the war had officially ended, but the refugees were still standing in snow. The rail station clerk filed a complaint at 14:10. Turner attached a requisition denial beside it. Both documents went to Colonel James Walker at 3rd Army Logistics Command before sunset. Rain hit the station roof. By nightfall, Walker ordered the entire incident forwarded upward. Colonel Walker read both reports before midnight. One came from the refugee station. The other came from Medical Transport Command. Neither used emotional language. The first listed destroyed inventory. The second listed expected casualties if the temperature dropped again. Walker already knew the broader problem. Thousands of displaced civilians were moving across Austria after the German surrender. Fuel shortages delayed trains. Bridges stayed damaged. Entire villages had no heating fuel left by May. 3rd Army depots were carrying captured German supplies because American shipments could not cover every camp at once. Blankets disappeared first, then boots, then winter clothing. Walker called the depot at 0040. Hayes defended the decision directly. The SS markings made the coats unusable. Photographs of refugees wearing SS uniforms could spread across occupation newspapers within days. One wrong image could damage every relief operation in the sector. Walker listened for almost 3 minutes. He wrote down only one sentence. 63 coats destroyed during snowfall. The room stayed quiet. At 02:15, another report arrived from the station doctor, Thomas Reed, Boston, age 42. He'd been supervising refugee medical transports for 9 months. He'd seen starvation edema, trench infections, and frozen civilian columns crossing the Czech border. But he'd never seen usable winter stock burned beside an active refugee line. Reed attached names to the medical report. Anna Weiss, age 61. Exposure fever after waiting outside for 6 hours. Carl Brenner, age 8. Persistent cough after sleeping beside an open freight car. 9 more civilians were listed as weather risk before dawn. The problem no longer belonged to one officer. Medical Command requested emergency release authority. Transportation Command requested replacement stock. Supply Command refused both requests until Occupation Headquarters clarified whether SS inventory could legally re-enter civilian circulation. Nobody below senior command wanted responsibility attached to the decision. That was the ceiling. If Walker released the equipment himself, he could face investigation after the occupation stabilized. If he refused, civilians could freeze while the coats sat inside army storage. By sunrise, the snow was deeper around the rail fence. Turner counted 118 civilians still waiting near the station. Only 55 blankets had arrived overnight. 2 soldiers started cutting canvas tarps into makeshift coverings beside the tracks. At 07:10, Walker sent the entire file forward to 3rd Army headquarters. The inventory sheets, the medical report, the photographs of burned uniforms behind the depot. By the next morning, it was sitting on Patton's desk. What Patton did next would place every officer connected to the burn order beside the refugee line before noon. Patton read the inventory sheet first. His thumb stopped beside the number 63. He turned one photograph over without looking at it again. Snow beside the burn pit, black smoke against white ground. Nobody in the office spoke. Patton set the papers down beside a folded operations map. His hand stayed there for several seconds. Outside, engines moved through the headquarters yard. Rain tapped against the window glass. He looked at Colonel Walker once. One officer burned winter clothing beside civilians standing in snow. Walker nodded. Patton stood up slowly. "Get the cars. We're taking them there now." One logistics officer named the risk immediately. "Sir, those were SS uniforms. If civilians are photographed wearing them, Occupation Command may intervene." Patton adjusted his gloves. "They'll intervene faster if civilians freeze beside American warehouses." Nobody answered after that. The hallway cleared before he reached the door. 4 stars on the helmet, olive drab combat jacket, ivory-handled revolvers high on the belt. 3 jeeps left headquarters at 08:40. Rain followed them north. The refugee line stretched past the rail fence when the jeeps arrived. Snow covered the edges of the road. Children stood beneath torn canvas sheets tied between carts. One army medic was rubbing heat back into an old man's hands beside the station wall. Patton stepped out first. Nobody saluted immediately. The supply officer was already waiting near the warehouse entrance. Captain Hayes removed his gloves once, then put them back on. Patton did not speak to him at first. He walked past the bone pit. Wet ash, half-melted buttons, black cloth frozen into the mud. The group followed behind him in silence. Colonel Walker, 2 depot officers, a transportation captain, 3 enlisted drivers. Nobody spoke during the inspection. Patton stopped beside the refugee line. A woman pulled a blanket tighter around 2 children standing against her legs. One boy wore boots without laces. Another civilian had wrapped burlap around both hands beneath the snow. Hayes looked away toward the trucks. Patton still said nothing. The line moved slowly beside them. 1 person every few seconds. No winter coats left to distribute. After several minutes, 1 logistics officer stepped backward from the group. He glanced toward the jeeps. Patton spoke without turning around. Those coats burned faster than these people will. Nobody moved after that. The inspection continued another 14 minutes. Patton ordered every officer connected to the disposal report to remain beside the station until replacement supplies arrived. No speeches, no threats, no humiliation, only the line. Army blankets reached the station before sunrise the next morning. 84 were unloaded beside the rail depot. 63 replacement winter coats were requisitioned within 48 hours from captured Wehrmacht storage near Linz. The medical station reported 11 exposure cases that night. None became fatalities. Captain Hayes signed the replacement inventory himself 2 days later. Patton walked back to the jeep. Snow hit the hood in small white streaks. The refugee station stayed open another 19 days. Army transport crews moved 412 displaced civilians through the rail line before the weather cleared. Captured German winter supplies were redistributed across 4 nearby camps by the end of May 1945. Third Army logistics officers quietly changed procedure after the incident. SS insignia were removed from confiscated clothing before redistribution. Storage officers documented markings separately. The equipment stopped being destroyed automatically if civilian shortages existed nearby. Thomas Reed survived the war. He went home to Boston, Massachusetts in 1946. In 1971, he was interviewed for a regional veterans archive connected to refugee operations in Austria. He said, "I remember the sound first. Wet snow against canvas, while those people stood there, looking at the warehouse." Reed died in 1988 at age 85. His interview transcript remained inside the archive collection after his death. Today, many temporary refugee railway stations from occupied Austria no longer exist. If you visit Salzburg today, several post-war displacement records and transport manifests can still be seen inside regional historical archives documenting civilian transfers during May 1945. Patton never mentioned the incident publicly. He never talked about it. In his diary, winter stock destroyed during civilian shortage, corrected on site. The officers involved defended the burn order for practical reasons. The SS uniform carried fear across Europe in 1945. Many Americans believed anything connected to it should disappear completely. But the civilians standing outside the station were cold before they were political. Would you have destroyed SS equipment completely or done what Patton did? Let us know in the comments if this story stayed with you. The full Patton playlist is linked below. Every episode goes deeper into the decisions that shaped the war. There is one more decision from this period of the war that nobody talks about. It is in the playlist.